Good evening and welcome to this webinar presented by EMENDY Multimedia Technology Institute. My name is Lorenz Penkler and tonight we'll be discussing modular synthesis with native instruments Reaktor Blocks. So what is modular synthesis? Modular synthesis is a form of synthesis where all of the components of the actual instrument are independent and can be wired freely. In this tutorial we're going to have a look at all of the different elements that make up a standard synthesizer, starting with the oscillators. Let's open up a new ensemble, file new ensemble, which gives us a container for our project. The blocks framework is accessible through the library under the browser, and there's a folder for Reaktor Blocks. Let's have a look at some of the bento box standard modules that are available here. Our oscillators are indicated by the acronym OSC, and each of the blocks can just be dragged directly into the project. Block is able to be wired to the outputs directly over here, and we don't have any signal to start off with because the frequency is at 0. As we increase that, we'll actually hear a tone, and we can change the waveform, but it doesn't stop. In order to be able to control the amplitude of the oscillator over time, we're going to need to add an additional module, which is a VCA, voltage controlled amplifier. The voltages aren't actually involved in this case. Standard module which will allow us to control the output of the oscillator, which runs consistently generating a periodic waveform, and that will then be wired into the outputs. We then have control over that amplitude on the output of the actual oscillator. Turn the project back on, and this control then allows us to do that. In order to make it a little bit more useful, we probably want to be able to control that from a keyboard, and that will then trigger a modulation source in the form of an envelope. So if we drag in an envelope, in this case an ADSR envelope, we can connect the output of this to the modulation A input of the VCA. You'll notice on every single block there's a mod A and a mod B input, which allows for quite a variety of routing of modulation signals, and in the actual panel those sources are indicated at the top as well. So if one is connected, it shows up. For the moment it's not actually active, but let us add a gate signal in order to actually trigger the envelope when a key gets pressed. That'll be found under utility, and we can actually use this note in module, which allows us to actually gather all of the MIDI information that comes from the controller and import that into the actual ensemble. So we can take our gate input, plug that into the gate this side, enable the A modulation, and there's an amount that is available now next to that control, and as I press a key it opens up the gate in accordance with the settings of the envelope. The next logical step is to control the pitch of the oscillator, making use of the keyboard. On the note in module, you'll notice there's a pitch output which can be connected directly to the pitch input of the oscillator, and just so long as this keyboard icon over here is enabled, it will be able to track MIDI messages coming through from the note in module. Right, within a modular framework, it's quite common to substitute a keyboard as a means of control of the oscillators for what's called a step sequencer, which allows us to iterate through different settings, triggering notes and gates. There's a 4-lane step sequencer that's available also from the bento box modules. See, we've got 4 different outputs, and it needs to be triggered by a gate. That gate is going to be triggered directly from a clock module is the standard way of doing it, but you can also trigger it from an LFO or any other kind of signal which will provide a periodic input. in order to kind of maintain coherence with the tempo of the actual project. If it's being used in a DAW, clock module is quite useful. So that can be connected up to the gate input over here. As we press play, it'll iterate through the different settings, and if I enable a couple of these inputs, I'll have triggers that are going through to the oscillator. We can then make use of the second lane to control the pitch input of the oscillator. So if we enable that, press play, and now we have a note sequence that relentlessly runs. Step sequence that can be customized to go through anything between 1 to 8 steps, and that provides a cycle that can be used. Next element that we might want to integrate into our setup, specifically if we want to be making use of some harsher waveforms, is a filter. We can just grab a filter from also the bento box set of tools, and we're going to run the oscillator into the filter and then out the other side. Right. In order just to tidy things up a little bit, just going to move some of these modules around. So we'll have our clock and sequence over here. It tends to make things a little bit easier in terms of tracking if they're set up in the same order as in the actual structure view over here. So, right. Okay, so now from our panel, if we run the sequence again, we can open up the a sequence with a little bit more grit, but we would probably like to actually control the cutoff frequency of our filter, making use of another modulation source, in this case an LFO, which we'll be able to also find in the bento box set of tools. I'll just drag it into my ensemble over here, and from the structure view I have an output for the LFO, which I'm going to connect as a modulation source to mod A on the filter. And if I go into the filter itself, you can see that we have a variation on the filter already that's visible with the A modulation enabled. And we have an amount, and the LFO has two modes: bipolar, where it will add and subtract to the set value, or unipolar, where it just increases, which makes a little bit more sense with our current setup. And now if we run this, we have a automatic opening and closing of the filter in line with the frequency of the LFO. Up until this point, we've been making use of exclusively bento box modules apart from our clock utility that's driving our sequencer. Let's have a look at bringing in some additional modules, namely the Monarch modules. We have the oscillator and filter module, as well as an envelope. Monarch is a Native Instruments recreation of the Mini Moog iconic synthesizer, and has received quite a lot of critical acclaim for the modeling that was done on the oscillators and filters. Our oscillator is actually able to recreate 3 different incarnations of the oscillator, and our envelopes are switchable between frequency and amplitude, which give it 2 different characters. If we go into our structure view, we'll be able to connect our modules up, but we encounter a bit of a situation here where we need to actually mix 2 audio chains into the output. The bento box toolkit provides a mix module, which will allow us to take our current sequence, run it into channel 1 of this mixer, and the sequence that I'm going to be building now, I'm going to run into channel 2, but as a amplitude shaping module, I'm going to make use again of a VCA and run that into channel 2 over here. We'll use the third lane of our sequencer to trigger the envelope, and that envelope will then drive our VCA via mod A. We'll use our oscillator to run into the filter, out of the filter into the VCA, and onto the mixer. Let's tidy up a little bit this side, put the mixer at the top, and I'm going to place my VCA after the filter. So let's turn down the amplitude of channel 1, turn up channel 2 so we can focus on the sequence that we're working with now. We will enable the modulation on mod A and increase the amount of modulation that's coming from our envelope over here. And from sequence 3 or lane 3 of the sequencer, we should have the signal that comes through. Right. We're going to make use of this chain to create a bit of a kick type of tone. Let's make use of an additional Monarch envelope over here that we're going to be running into the filter. So we'll set that to filter mode, and from our structure view we're going to run this into the mod A input of our filter. It'll be triggered by the same gate signal as our envelope that is running the VCA. It's going to be happening at the same time. And here what we're going to be triggering is the actual cutoff frequency of our filter. We're also going to increase the resonance to give a little bit more emphasis on the actual transient of the kick that we're trying to work on. We'll then be able to enable the modulation input on the cutoff frequency of the filter and add an amount to that. We now have a transient, slightly over pronounced, bringing down the decay, sustain over here. We end up with a much cleaner transient, and we can probably change the waveform and tune our oscillator slightly. Which gives us a kick with a little bit of a knock and some bottom end to it. We can then bring back in our original sequence, and that's an additional component to our ensemble. We're now going to have a look at creating a higher frequency motif, making use of noise. For our noise-based rhythmic motif, we're going to be making use of two Kodiak modules, the flip gen in association with a curve sequencer. The curve sequencer, for those of you that are familiar with Massive, is quite reminiscent of the Performer. We will now just bring down the levels of the two former elements as well as this one, and in our structure view we're going to connect the output of our oscillator to input 3 over here, and the two outputs from the two separate modulation lanes into mod A and mod B. We're going to be using the same gate signal as for the bento sequencer to run this one, so that everything operates in sync. And now in our panel, what we're going to do is we're going to bring down frequencies of both of the frequencies of the flip generator here. I'm going to increase the speed, reduce the smoothness, and increase the instability. On our sequencer over here, we're going to change the curves to something a little bit more rhythmical as a starting point. So with a steeper curve, and on our second lane over here, what we're going to do is we're going to just actually randomize the curve as well as the levels. We'll associate modulation A with the frequency of B within the oscillator, and we're going to reduce the speed in accordance with the curves on the second lane. What we're also going to do here is we're going to randomize the progression of our rhythmical pattern over here on both, just to add an element of randomness. Just bring up level 3 over here and then play it. Shapes in here as well, just to increase a certain amount of variation. And bring back in the other elements. Thank you for joining me for this webinar. Bit of an overview of modular synthesis with reactor blocks. Very much scratching the surface at this stage. There's no end to the possibilities with modular synthesis. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next webinar. Cheers.